Racist serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin has been executed.
What goes through a killer's mind when he knows the clock is ticking toward his final breath? Did he feel remorse for the brutal murders he committed, or was his fear of death the only thing that consumed him? Joseph Paul Franklin, America's most feared racist serial killer, woke up on November 19, 2013, knowing he had less than 24 hours to live. After decades on death row, his time had finally run out. But what happened in those last hours was not what anyone expected. A shocking visitor, a final confession, and a last-minute twist that nearly stopped his execution. This is the haunting final day of Joseph Paul Franklin. Joseph Paul Franklin didn't start out as a killer. In fact, for much of his early life, he was just another troubled young man trying to find his place in the world. But somewhere along the way, that darkness grew. And by the time he was in his 20s, his name would become synonymous with terror and hate. Born on April 13, 1950 in Mobile, Alabama, Franklin was raised in a turbulent household. His father, a deeply religious man, and his mother, who struggled with mental health, created a chaotic home environment. Franklin's father was strict, and the family moved frequently, which isolated him from forming stable friendships. By the time he was a teenager, Franklin had developed a strong sense of alienation and began adopting extremist views. In his early adulthood, Franklin became obsessed with the idea of racial purity, and by the 1970s, he was actively involved with white supremacist groups. His beliefs were deeply influenced by his growing animosity towards interracial relationships and civil rights movements, especially after reading books by radical figures like George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party. Joseph Paul Franklin's crimes were as shocking as they were ruthless. For years, he roamed across the country, fueled by an obsession to cleanse the world of those he saw as inferior, especially Black and Jewish people. His mission was filled with violence, and he left a trail of destruction wherever he went. In July 1997, Franklin's spree began with an attack on Beth Shalom Synagogue in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He firebombed the building, but due to the early departure of some worshipers, there were no fatalities. It was a narrow escape, one that Franklin would later boast about, explaining it was only the beginning of his mission to eliminate undesirables. In August 1977, in Madison, Wisconsin, Franklin shot and killed an interracial couple, Alphonse Manning Jr. and Tony Schwen, in a mall parking lot. This brutal act was the first of many, and Franklin would later be convicted of both murders. In October 1977, in St. Louis, Missouri, Franklin opened fire outside a synagogue, killing Gerald Gordon, a respected Jewish community leader. In July 1978, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Franklin firebombed a synagogue, causing massive damage. Though no one was hurt, the message of terror was clear. In March 6, 1978, in Oklahoma, he shot and killed a black man and his white girlfriend as they walked across a parking lot. The victims were targeted solely because they were an interracial couple. Hours later, Franklin carried out another sniper attack on another interracial couple, killing the man instantly. In 1979, Taco Bell manager Harold McIver, a black man, was fatally shot through a window from 150 yards in Doraville, Georgia. Franklin confessed, but was not tried or sentenced for this crime. Franklin said that McIver was in close contact with white women, so he murdered him. Again in August, Franklin shot Raymond Taylor. He was seated in a Burger King restaurant in Falls Church, Virginia. In 1980, Franklin confessed to shooting and seriously wounding civil rights activist and Urban League president Vernon Jordan after seeing him with a white woman in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Franklin initially denied any part in the crime and was acquitted, but later confessed. In July, Franklin killed cousins Darrell Lane and Dante Evans Brown in Cincinnati, Ohio. Waiting on an overpass to shoot a racially mixed couple, he shot the boys instead, a crime to which he later confessed. He was convicted in 1998 and received 2 life sentences for these murders. Franklin shot and killed Arthur Smothers and Kathleen McCullough with a high-powered rifle in 1980 as the couple walked across the Washington Street Bridge in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Smothers was black. McCullough was white. On the day of the murder, Franklin took a concealed position on a wooded hillside overlooking downtown Johnstown and waited for potential targets to enter his line of sight. He was never arrested for these murders, but he confessed to them during a jailhouse interview after he was apprehended. In total, Joseph Paul Franklin confessed to more than 20 murders across the country. He saw every killing as part of a racial cleansing mission, cold, calculated, and without mercy. For years, Joseph Paul Franklin managed to evade the law, but his eventual capture would be both a stroke of luck for law enforcement and a dark chapter in his criminal history. Franklin was arrested in 1980 after he attempted to rob a store in Missouri, though not for the murders he had committed. This arrest led to the eventual unraveling of his string of crimes. During his time in custody, his mugshot was widely circulated, and Franklin's violent tendencies began to surface more openly. It wasn't until 1985, after Franklin had been linked to the string of murders through ballistic evidence and witness testimony, that authorities were able to definitively tie him to his killing spree. By 1985, Franklin's reign of terror had come to an end. His trial would reveal the full extent of his hatred and his crimes. In 1985, Franklin was convicted for the murders of at least 8 people, though he is believed to have killed more. He was sentenced to death in Missouri, though his trial was complicated by his mental state. Franklin maintained a cold demeanor throughout the proceedings, expressing no remorse for his actions. Over the years, he received multiple life sentences, but the most critical came from Missouri. In 1997, for the murder of Gerald Gordon outside the Brith Sholom Knesset Israel Congregation Synagogue, Franklin was sentenced to death. After the judge read the sentence, death by lethal injection, Joseph Paul Franklin was led away from the courtroom, back to the steel and concrete world that had been his home for years. But now the weight was heavier. He wasn't just another prisoner anymore. He was a man marked for death. For over 3 decades, Franklin sat on death row, isolated from the outside world at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. His days were long, repetitive, and silent, just him, the prison walls, and his own mind. Some inmates on death row spend their years writing letters, meeting with family, or working on appeals. But Franklin was different. He filed countless lawsuits, challenging everything from the conditions of his confinement to the methods of execution themselves. He even sued the Missouri Department of Corrections, claiming that lethal injection was cruel and unusual punishment, despite being the very system that offered him a far more peaceful death than the violence he had inflicted. At times, he made strange public statements. He claimed he had found God while in prison. He said he had renounced his racist beliefs, the same hatred that had driven him to murder so many innocent people. But for the families of his victims, those words rang hollow. No apology could bring their loved ones back. No confession could erase the fear he had caused. Inside his small, windowless cell, the days blurred together. The years dragged on. Appeal after appeal was filed and denied. Hope became thinner with every letter, every court date, every passing year. Still, Franklin fought. Even in his final months, he filed emergency appeals, arguing that the drugs used in Missouri's lethal injections were unsafe. But the courts had heard enough. The families had waited long enough. The sentence that had been handed down all those years ago would finally be carried out. In November 2013, the final execution date was set. There would be no more delays. There would be no last-minute rescue. Joseph Paul Franklin, who had spent a lifetime judging others and deciding who should live and die, was now left to face his own ending. Alone. The countdown to his final 24 hours had begun. November 19, 2013. The clock started ticking on Joseph Paul Franklin's last full day alive. In less than 24 hours, he would be dead. At 6 o'clock sharp, as the first gray light of morning crept over Potosi Correctional Center, a steel door clanged open. Joseph Paul Franklin opened his eyes to his final sunrise, a sunrise he would never see again. He lay still for a moment, no flinch, no panic, just a long, cold stare at the ceiling above him. The same cracked paint, the same cold walls, only today they weren't just walls. They were the last thing he would ever know of this earth. Prison guards stepped closer, alert and unsmiling. Franklin was officially placed on death watch, the most intense, suffocating supervision a man could endure. 2 officers stationed right outside his door, staring in at all times. Lights on, cameras rolling, no shadows to hide in. Every breath, every blink, every move, recorded, logged, and judged. But Joseph Paul Franklin didn't rage against it. He didn't scream, beg, or break down. He just sat up slowly, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down without fear. What was running through his mind? Was it the faces of the people he gunned down? Was it memories of a violent life fueled by hate? Or had he, in these last hours, made peace with the idea that no one would mourn his death? Breakfast came around 7, a standard tray, scrambled eggs, toast, maybe some grits. The same bland meal served to every inmate. But for Franklin, it might as well have been ashes on a plate. He barely touched the food. He picked at it without focus, as if the simple act of eating was beneath him now. His body was still alive, but his mind was already halfway gone. No visitors came that morning, no family, no friends, not a single soul from the outside world wanted to say goodbye. And Franklin? He didn't ask for them either. He spent those quiet morning hours alone, locked in a concrete tomb of his own making. But while Franklin sat behind bars, cold and calm, outside the prison walls, a storm was brewing. One unexpected legal move was coming, and it would throw his final day into chaos. As the noon hour crept over Potosi Correctional Center, the walls seemed to close in tighter around Joseph Paul Franklin. Every tick of the clock was a countdown now, not just to death, but to judgment. By midday, Franklin remained eerily calm. He showed no outward signs of fear, no pleas for mercy. He had no visitors scheduled, no family, no last-minute spiritual advisors. Only guards and the cold machinery of the justice system surrounding him. Lunch was served around noon, another basic prison tray, the same as any other day. But this meal was different. This was a dead man's meal. And yet Franklin barely ate. He pushed the food around, unfocused, almost detached from the reality tightening around him. Inside his mind, what played? Was he reliving the twisted ideologies that drove him to murder innocent people? Then, just when it seemed the road to death was clear, chaos struck. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, news broke. A federal judge had halted the execution, questioning the use of Missouri's lethal injection drugs. A temporary stay of execution was ordered. For a few surreal hours, Franklin's fate hung in limbo. Would he die tonight? Or would the clock reset and buy him a few more tortured months or years? Inside his cell, Franklin received the news, but witnesses said he showed almost no reaction, no smile, no outrage, just that same ghostly calm, as if death, delay, or freedom made no difference anymore. But the system was moving faster than Franklin could imagine. By nightfall, a higher court would make a decision that sealed his fate once and for all. As darkness settled over Missouri, the walls of Potosi Correctional Center seemed to pulse with tension. For Joseph Paul Franklin, every hour felt heavier than the last. The night of November 19th would be his last night alive. By 6 o'clock that evening, the mood inside the prison had shifted. The temporary stay on Franklin's execution was lifted. The 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals had ruled. The execution would proceed as planned. Missouri had planned to use propofol, the surgical anesthetic made infamous by the death of pop star Michael Jackson. But Nixon reversed that decision after being warned that the European Union, whose members forbid capital punishment, might halt shipments of the drug, leading to shortages for medical purposes. Missouri and other states that conduct executions have had to scramble for new drugs after European-based manufacturers banned American prisons from using their drugs in executions. When Franklin heard the news, there was no visible outburst, no panic, just that same eerie calm, the look of a man who had accepted that his time had finally run out. Inside his small death watch cell, the preparations began. He declined a special last meal and instead ate the standard prison dinner. A basic tray of meatloaf, potatoes, vegetables. Franklin ate little. Some witnesses later said he barely touched the food at all. No visitors came to see him, no final embraces, no tearful goodbyes. He was utterly alone. As the hours crept past 8, 9, 10 o'clock, the prison staff kept close watch. Franklin remained quiet and cooperative, just waiting. Some prisoners beg for their lives, others rage against the injustice. But Franklin? He sat in silence, staring at a world he would soon leave behind. Around 11:30, guards moved Franklin to the holding area next to the execution chamber. He was fitted with restraints, asked if he had any final words. He declined. No final statement, no apologies, no justifications. There was only the slow shuffle down the final hallway, a dead man walking toward the cold metallic table where the last act would unfold. As the clock struck midnight on November 20th, time became a living, breathing presence inside Potosi Correctional Center. Every second echoed louder than the last. Joseph Paul Franklin had less than 6 hours left in this world. He lay on the thin mattress of the holding cell, knowing there would be no sunrise for him. There was no religious counselor by his side, no family members watching from behind the glass. Just the cold company of guards, medical personnel, and the ticking hands of death. At around 5:30 in the morning, the final preparations began. Franklin was escorted into the execution chamber, a sterile, fluorescent-lit room designed for one grim purpose. It was time. Dressed in a simple prison uniform, Franklin was led quietly down the hallway to the execution chamber inside Missouri's Potosi Correctional Center. Witnesses watched from behind a glass pane as Franklin, wearing black-rimmed glasses and his long hair tucked neatly behind his ears, was strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, Franklin simply stared ahead. He chose silence over any last statement. Not a single word was spoken. At exactly 6:07 a.m., the execution began. For the first time in Missouri's history, a single drug, 5 grams of pentobarbital, flowed into Franklin's veins instead of the usual 3-drug cocktail. Witnesses from the Associated Press watched closely. Franklin blinked a few times, breathed heavily, swallowed hard. Then, his chest began to slow. He breathed a few more heavy, desperate gulps, and then he simply stopped breathing. By 6:17 a.m., he was officially pronounced dead. The guards closed the curtains as medical personnel checked for a pulse. Just like that, a man who spent his life trying to destroy others was finally gone. Missouri Governor Jay Nixon later issued a statement. The cowardly and calculated shootings outside a St. Louis area synagogue were part of Joseph Paul Franklin's long record of murders and other acts of extreme violence across the country, fueled by religious and racial hate. There were no riots, no crowds, no final words of hate, only a silent, empty room, and the closing of one of America's darkest chapters. His victims were forever lost, and the hate he spread in his lifetime still echoes in dark corners of the world. While Franklin's execution brought an end to his terror, it didn't erase the scars he left behind. But perhaps the most haunting part of Franklin's legacy is this. In his final hours, he showed no remorse, no last-minute change of heart, no acknowledgement of the lives he destroyed or the hatred he fed. His death wasn't about closure. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was simply the closing chapter of a life built on violence and fear. Yet the question remains: was justice truly served? His execution might have silenced one man, but it has only added fuel to the debate surrounding the death penalty. For some, Franklin's death was long overdue. For others, it raises deeper questions about accountability, redemption, and the price of vengeance. As we reflect on Franklin's final moments, we're left to grapple with a chilling truth: that in a world fueled by hatred, there will always be another Joseph Paul Franklin lurking in the shadows, waiting to leave their mark. And so, his death may have ended his reign of terror, but it remains a somber reminder of the need for vigilance against the forces of intolerance and division. Thank you for watching. If you found this story eye-opening, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into true crime, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think justice was served? Let's talk about it.